graduated from Santa Monica High School and entered UCLA. Well, I went to Santa Monica City College, went to UCLA as a sociology major. Then I switched to a history major. Then I became an art major. Then I was drafted in the Korean War. And so I went away for 2 years, came back, took a few more classes, and then got the opportunity to go, this is during the Cold War, to be as a photographer for Douglas Aircraft Company in England, where we were doing missiles, putting missiles up. And that took another 2 more years. So my third attempt to come back to school wasn't until 1960, and I was 27 years old. I'd learned an awful lot. I'd had the opportunity to travel. I had gone on a cargo ship from London to Hong Kong. And I say and tell you that because it was really then that I discovered world crafts. I all of a sudden saw how dependent societies were on the craftsmen of the country, particularly in India and Indonesia. And I also was introduced, obviously, to beautiful textiles. And I couldn't buy anything. I didn't have enough money, but I could take pictures of it. And when I got home, I saw I had taken in China, I had taken pictures of wonderful raincoats and baskets. And it just seemed like this was really something that I would enjoy. In 1960, John Kennedy became our president, and there was in my way of thinking, not necessarily my family, but there was a very buoyant kind of feeling that you should pursue what you want to do for some kind of happiness. The idea of making money simply was not something that I thought was very important. I wanted to find something that my father had found in his professional life as a baseball player. He thought it was fantastic. So I took ceramics. I met my future wife in the ceramics class with Laura Andresen. And then there was an elective called surface patterning. The first assignment, the teacher had asked us to explore different ways that patterns can happen. A brick pattern, a half-drop pattern, a random pattern. And she asked for 5 or 6 examples. I went to the store to buy cloth, not really knowing what I was doing. I bought a yellow, a red, a green, a blue, and laid them all out on the floor of the kitchen and started printing with no preconceived ideas at all as to what colors should go with what. Because at that particular time, you had very specific, you had sort of a Finnish look in terms of home interiors. This is the last part of the 50s. It was before the flower children and all that kind of thing. And so I just simply started stamping away. If the orange went on the blue, the orange had to go on the yellow. It had to go like this. And I probably came into the class with huge sheets of patterns like this, of probably 20 or 30 examples, where the rest of the class had 6. And immediately, all of a sudden, the class saw what the challenge was. And from then on, we were fantastic in terms of what we learned together, in terms of what one can do. These were 2 examples of just the kind of patterning that I did with block prints. It was very primitive kind of methods of working. They called them Nasdar textile paints, but they were really almost like house paints. You had to clean them with turpentine. It was nothing that you saw that you were going to move right into the industry with. UCLA was not set up for that kind of thing. They were not teaching you to be professional at all. They were just giving you sort of a broad, general kind of applied arts kind of education. There was no attempt at all to think of what we were doing as art even. I was saying in the morning class, when we had to do textiles, the instructors wanted them 3 yards in length, because if they came out well, they could go in the student show. And the student show was important for the faculty because then they could promote their own courses. You know, it was a kind of self-serving kind of thing that went on. I tell you that because after we learned this and we went into I went into these tie-dye pieces. All of these were done in 1961 and 62. This one has a silk screen on top of it. This was actually a batik piece I did. I saw them doing batiks in Indonesia, and I saw the way that they did them, and I thought, well, gee, I think I could get something going there where I just sort of heated the block, put it in wax, and would print it that way. And I actually did this at night. When I got off work at 12:30, I'd go up to the art department and work all night because I didn't want anybody interrupting me. One time, I came out with a piece, this was to have been 3 yards of a fabric, but I used a silk noil, and I could immediately see that it was a real dud. Nothing was happening on it. But we all looked at it in the class and sort of said, oh my God, look at the sculpture. You know, we didn't say sculpture. We weren't sophisticated enough for that. We said, isn't that interesting? Yeah, but it's supposed to be 3 yards for the student show. And the instructor said nothing. Oh, isn't that interesting? But that could be dangerous because it could be art. So therefore, let's not think that way, because we're design. And the artists are upstairs and they hate us, you know, that kind of thing. And so so I've always hung on to this piece as one of those examples of doing an awful lot of work and not capturing the moment of what could have been to move us forward, but sort of settled as, oh well, throw it on the shelf and not deal with it. So these are little wooden balls inside all of that, and it would have been a fabulous piece, but it never worked. Anyway, so that was the end of that. While I was working on these China silk, and I don't know if any of you are weaver enough to know that China silk probably has, what do you think, 300 ends per inch, you know, just an awful lot. I decided that I wanted to, I didn't want to do this anymore. I wanted to learn how to weave. Weaving wasn't even offered in the art department. It was in the basement next to the women's restroom in Royce Hall. So you really had to find the course, and Bernard Kester taught it. And he was trying to make something out of textiles in terms of maybe pushing it so that it could become an art form, because it was always sort of relegated to piano benches and upholstery and all that kind of stuff. And so I went into the class, and I had never had Bernard Kester before. If any of you know him, he's an unforgettable personality. And I said to him, I want to take this class, but I'm not going to do a Rhea rug, and I'm not going to do a piece of yardage for my piano bench. I want to do something else, and I don't know what it is. But I think I want to weave China silk. He said, be my guest. There's the silk. So I went over, and right away I saw what the problem was, because 300 ends per inch is an awful lot. And I think probably here I have 12. For a beginning weaver, this is my first weaving. And it's one that it's my favorite weaving I've ever done. Because all of a sudden I saw what the sculptural possibilities were of doing this kind of work, but doing it on my own cloth. This is tie-dyed, as you see. And actually I was even trying, by using the purple here, I was even trying to approximate that kind of thing. Now, hold your applause. I know it doesn't mean a lot to you, but I learned an awful lot from it. This is all silk. except I started using acrylics on it, and the acrylics are not affected by the dyes, because the dyes are for acid dyes. And so all of a sudden I thought, oh my God, this is kind of a neat thing. And I would say for the next 5 or 6 years, all of my work dealt with the idea of weaving something with the idea that it was to be submerged. And so this is weaving number 1, and we'll go on from there. I also at the same time did batik work. This is, I say, is a batik, and I would weave it. This is a sample for a piece that became a much larger piece. Oh, by the way, on the back wall here is a small piece like this. It's an e-cut that I did in 1975 while living in Oaxaca. I got a letter from Jack Larson saying he would like to include me in a show that's promoting one of his books called The Dyer's Art. And the show was to be in New York. And I sent Jack a picture of what it was I was doing. He sent back and said, okay, but make it 3 times as big. And living in Oaxaca and being around people who were doing sort of small, intimate kind of things, I said, what's this with the big piece? Where's this going? Well, of course, that was the time that Portman was putting up all the big hotels all over the place. Giant buildings were being built, and they needed some kind of sound abatement in the lobbies, and so they wanted big sculptural pieces, and textile filled the bill. And so the piece back there, only 4 weeks ago did I finally cut it back down to its original size, because, and I like it better. So that was an e-cut I did that traveled for 3 years with the Larson show from 76 to 78 or 79. Anyway, this was another piece where you're waxing out the surface, submerging the whole thing, bringing it back out. The backside doesn't get it because the wax doesn't hit it. And so these were all based on the kind of information that I was learning from the very first class I did. So there's one you can take around, and with that, let's see. Well, I can't find him now. There's someplace. All right. Well, this was my master's show in 1968. 2 of us had shows at the same time, Netta Al-Hilali and I. We had our master's show. They wouldn't give us an MFA. In fact, Bernard wasn't sure they would grant us a show in an MA because it was textiles. Netta had her show in the lobby of the auditorium, and I had mine in the rec center. They didn't allow us to put those pieces in the wide art gallery. It was just as simply, it was something that hadn't been proven at all. Sort of an attitude that was happening at the time. Okay. In 1979, I taught a seminar at UCLA, and one of the books I selected was The Bridesman Password. And it's a conversation with Duchamp, Tingpe, Cage, Rauschenberg, and Cunningham. And it was the first time that I really became aware of the power of John Cage. It's a wonderful book, and it's still in print. And in it, John Cage talks about composing music based on chance. And I was searching for some kind of way to get out of the dictates that I thought my education had been with all of the... In other words, I was looking for something that was a little bit more personal and not something that was so applied on me. I wanted someone to ask me why I was doing what I was doing, and nobody ever asked those questions. And so, anyway, I became aware of Cage and also Cunningham. Merce Cunningham died last year, and in the LA Times, they had a wonderful quote from him talking about what nature offers us. in terms of chance. And he says you can be walking along, and a bird goes from here to there. And then all of a sudden a rabbit goes from there to there. And then the wind blows. And all of those kinds of things. And I thought, wouldn't that be kind of fabulous to try to get that kind of expression into my work? And at the same time, I'd been doing some study of the Navajo and on the wedge weave. And the wedge weave is a weave that the Navajos did in the 1880s and the 1890s. It didn't last very long because everything gets misshapen. And the Puritans getting off the train in Santa Fe or Topeka, Kansas, didn't like that kind of a bulge. You know, it was just too suggestive, I guess. And they went for the Chinese rugs. And so the Navajos, being very good merchants, said, well, let's not do those anymore. But it was exactly that kind of thing that I loved about wedge weave. And so I got to thinking, gosh, if I could get chants of John Cage and wedge weave going. When we moved to Tennessee, I left UCLA for a while, get a breath of air, and I've got a little sample here. I would stretch the warp on the table. It's unwoven. I would take my dyes. I would mix the dyes. I decided what to do. And then whatever number came up, I would lay a template on it and paint that color in. And then the next one would come, and I'd do the next color, and so on and so forth. Number 6 was always a bar. If a bar went in, then I would change direction. And I did a number of pieces in that way. In fact, I did 11 pieces. And each one, I got more and more involved in the process. And I had a show at the Elements Gallery in Tribeca. The Elements had moved from Madison Avenue, gone to Tribeca, which was really avant-garde at the time. And all the pieces sold. And that was really a wonderful kind of feeling. I've got all my junk around here, and let's see if I can find, here. This was the very first, and I'll pass these around. This was the very first one I did, where the warps were all strung out, and you see the bar that goes, it goes down. I got this idea while playing Clue with the family. Remember the idea of Clue? And little Abigail, our youngest, could be halfway into the sanitarium to find the body of Mrs. Green hit by a candlestick, and I'm still trying to get up the front walk because all I keep getting are 1s and 2s, and Abby's getting 6. Well, look what happens all of a sudden. All of a sudden, whatever black was, I was getting a whole lot of it. But I love that kind of chance way that things were going, and it sort of gets you away from that Western kind of orientation of having everything so balanced and fine and beautiful. So this was then the same series that went on. And then this is still up at 5th Avenue and 53rd. 53rd. They photographed one of those pieces for a mural, and these are about probably 36 inches. Well, the piece is only that big. But so it's sort of interesting to see how the life of them go on. And this is one of them that never made it. In other words, this shows you how this would be painted on and then woven in that. So that is called wedge weave. And then one other one, while sitting on the 405 freeway, after 2 years in the Appalachia, we came back to UCLA, and the commute, we lived in San Pedro, and so I had this enormous commute every day. And it gave me an opportunity while sitting on the freeway to dream up color schemes that would be really a challenge to use. Not only did I want to avoid beautiful color, I wanted it to be something that would be a challenge to weave. So right in my mind, I thought celadon and brown and black and yellow and sounds pretty gross. Let's do it. So this again would be throwing the dice and making this. But then what I had discovered, getting more sophisticated and trying to get more control, I'm a very controlling person, so my wife says, that the stripes allow them to begin to put it in some sort of sequence. So that was what this became. Somebody flew to Japan and sent me this book. I didn't know anything about it, but this is the piece that they had. And I thought of all those 707s with all those seats and all those pockets behind the seats, have one of these in it. So that was that. And that's sort of, I'll show you some other things. I got away from the stripes and went into, this is still wedge weave going on, but now the wedge weave, I switched over to indigo blue and then the blue, and then working against the blue and the white. So now what I'd like, I said something about living in Oaxaca, and I'll show you this. This is, of course, a woman's outfit. It's called a huipil. And they have a tradition of taking silk. This is finely spun silk. I've got a picture of this lady you'll see a little later. But this is a fine, fine silk. And I met this woman in 1970 and bought as much silk as I possibly could from her. And she dyes it, and then they weave, her mother weaves this wonderful sash. So this is hand-spun silk, synthetic dyed, it's not a natural dye at all. And it's used on 2 costumes in Oaxaca. Now sometimes they dye the silk and they don't rinse it. And it's so, I have this purposefully in a bag because the moment you stick your hands into it, it gets on you, it gets in your nose and all that. But they weave this, and then they dip it in water and let it bleed. And then in another instance, they use it as a brocade. Here it is as a brocade. You know, there's a brocade with this heavily saturated dyed yarn, and then they fold it, and this bleeds onto that. So the image is, and this just is a tradition in the area, see? So this is from that, folded, as you can imagine, like that, and clamped and stuck in water. And then in another town, they weave with wool, and they stretch the huipil on a frame, and then they paint with the same dye. A fustic dye. It's a very cheap dye, and it goes on it, and it sort of almost looks like crushed velvet from a distance. You know, it has a funny kind of look to it. Okay, so with that, the piece I explored these. There's a piece I did. And there's the print from it. And then later on, and that's the print from another piece I'll have to show you a slide because the piece sold. But I was just sort of exploring this idea of, you know, trying to use a technique that they're using down in Oaxaca in a sort of a new kind of way. So all of these little pieces are just prints off of weavings. I was going to try to make multiple prints off of this. I did make quite a few prints off of this. This is just one piece of silk, but I had multiple layers of silk in there, so I got about 2 or 3 copies off of that one print. I'm not particularly fond of that. I just think it's interesting to see a process like that. So that is what that is. Okay, and now we're going to, let's see. All right. Now we get into the late, well, let's say the 90s at UCLA, and I'd been there. I was chair. Oh, one thing I didn't show you, and this is kind of interesting to see. When I went into weaving, I thought I knew all I had to know about color because I'd done all these textiles, and they, you know, I felt successful about the way I was working with color. When you go into weaving, weaving is a very different kind of thing because the color interacts in a much more intimate kind of way. And if you look at the strident kind of color of the fringe here, but look what the one yarn does to all those colors, how it modifies them all. The idea, and that's something I had to learn in the beginning, because when you can think you know a lot about color, but until you begin to interlace them, you begin to see that certain colors simply do not work together as well as others. So here you have a simple green modifying every one of those colors till it brings them into some sort of harmony, which I think is kind of an interesting thing for you to see. When was it? 86 to 1990, I was chair of the department at UCLA. Those were very arduous years. And after I got out of the chairmanship, I went back into a program, a textile program, that really hardly existed anymore. By 1990, and this is something that we've all, one way or another, if you're old enough, have realized that all of a sudden, Lois, I'm not talking to you. I shouldn't have even brought it up. Anyway, the idea that all of a sudden new things, new techniques, a lot of new dimensions of life have come, and all of a sudden the crafts at UCLA and the Department of Design, which were hanging on by a thread anyway, were already, simply nobody wanted to learn them anymore. That they just simply were not viable because I was competing with new technologies, new electronic technologies. And when you've got movies like The Talking Pig, I can't remember, Babe, coming out, and people coming to the department from those kind of companies, Rhythm and Hues, asking if students there could come over and also help us make movies and all that. The idea of sitting in a loom no longer looked like it was a viable kind of way to work. And I could understand that. It hurt an awful lot. And I used this apron as an example because I'd been making paper, and there was a faculty meeting. And I walked into the faculty meeting with the apron on and looked around the room, and it looked like Wall Street. You know, the faculty had, like, overnight become something that I wasn't used to. They were all electronic geniuses. They sat at computers. They talked a language I could not understand. And I thought, Jim, you've got a problem here. What are you going to do? Because if students aren't taking your classes, obviously you're either going to have to retire or you find something else. The apron back there is really based on this one, the one where I said I weave software. And they were talking about, I mean, we're using the same looms that we've had since the beginning of time. And I didn't really, on the budget, ever ask for a whole lot of money. And the people in the computer lab are asking yet for new computers. I said, didn't you just get them last year? Well, we need new software. What is software? I know what software is. What is software? And so there was this kind of conversation going on. I said, you know, it's time to move on. But anyway, that was sort of that poignant moment when I realized that weaving was no longer going to be something that I could offer at that particular university. But actually it had a brighter side because the Department of World Arts and Cultures wanted a course taught in studio, and I offered a course for World Arts and Culture students called Design Processes World Cultures, and it became a very, very popular course. But I was no longer really I was teaching in my room, but I was no longer a part of my particular department anymore. And at the same time, I got on this sort of idea of looking at electronics and figuring out how I might be able to explore these techniques in a more primitive kind of way. That apron I didn't mention to you is using a maybe 3rd century weaving technique because you're using a very, very primitive loom. The only way it could be woven is the way I wove it, which means you're with 2 sticks and a thread. And I was invited to be in a show where it had the piece was to be 8 inches by 8 inches. And I was trying to think, what could I do that would be interesting? And I went to the kitchen to turn the light out. And all of a sudden, the glow of all the digital clocks in the kitchen, from the microwave, from the oven, and all that were glowing at me. And I finally looked at a digital clock, and I thought, you know, I could weave that. I can weave. It just means that you have to get up and change it occasionally. But a digital clock, all you need is a corner, a left turn or a right turn, and a straight line. And so for this piece, and I'll show you a picture of it, I did 16 cubes. These are little preliminary ones I did. I was trying different color on them and all that. But the idea is that you keep manipulating them around until it spells out, you know, what it is you want to spell out. And so that was sort of another breakthrough that I had. Don't eat them, Eudora. I know that with a little cheese it might go down, but... And since we're talking also about the future, my latest plan is to weave a flag as if the Peruvians had landed on Plymouth Rock. And as I said earlier this morning, I'm not saying if only the Peruvians had landed on Plymouth Rock, but if they had, you know, the Puritans, there was not much of there was somewhat of a weaving tradition. I mean, obviously they wove their own clothes. But if you can imagine that this would be, the Peruvians were great at this is called scaffold weave. And of course I've only done one of them. And this is all with cochinilla, which is the little bug. I bought even from one of our infested cactuses at home. Here is the cochinilla. It will eventually kill the nopal. But anyway, here is, now you see what's happening here is the warp only goes as far as what you're trying to define. And then this is a natural brown cotton, so the Peruvians could have used that. They would have used cochineal. And then I'm thinking that the piece would be like this, or it could even be bigger. And then this is what I did for you people last night. This shows how primitive this loom is. It's going to have stars on it. And I'm not exactly sure what the alternative will be, whether it'll be more brown going up or how many stars. Maybe there'll just be one star, but then that'll look like Texas, so I don't want that. So we'll at least have to have 2 stars, right? But I love doing this. I love, you know what you do? It's problem solving is what I get involved with. And sometimes they don't always come out that great. But it's the process of trying to figure out how to do something that spurs me on. And I got so excited by this the other day, just trying to figure out, can I do it? And I'm sure my stars will get better. But can't you imagine a field of that and then a field of blue? You know, white. And this is the silk from the lady in Oaxaca. And this is indigo. So it's all natural. So that's my current plan. I'm not exactly sure of how that one's going to go out. I want you all to see that and say, boy, does he have a lot of patience. But you see, Lois, you can sit in a pool and do that. I don't think of me as some, you know, Dickens kind of office with a, you know. I mean, I did the shallow end. Don't you like it? You know, I could probably go underwater with it.
It'll bleed.
Yeah, well, no, that's true. I can't do that. And I didn't show this in the morning class because I don't know why. But, you know, the way art has gone lately and the way, you won't be able to see this. Maybe that's why I didn't do it. But this is the piece of paper that was underneath when I was weaving software. So all the scratches are from my needle, and if that's not subtle, isn't that beautiful?
Yes.
And this is where all the Xerox stuff got eaten off by my needle as I was weaving it. Okay. Let's see the slides very quickly. And this was a show at the Elements Gallery. It was really quite a thrill. And from that money, actually, Verily and I were able to build our studio. And based on it also, I got an NEA grant. And only from the NEA grant did UCLA finally give me tenure. I mean, I had to fight that all the time. Again, just because of working in textiles, I think. For a while, I started taking them and weaving them, and then simply cutting them up. And this sort of reflects the ceremonial robes of the North American Indian, and trying to make it sort of approximate a buffalo robe. And so it's all cut up, and so a weaver looking at this would have a very hard time figuring it out, because it really is more like a quilt. Finally, I just did a big wedge to talk about wedge weave, and this is when I switched over to indigo dye with linen. And it's also been beadled, which is a process used in Africa quite a bit, where linen is a great source of paper making, and it can withstand heavy beating, and so you just pound it and pound it and pound it till the surface becomes rather shiny. And this is, trying to accentuate that diagonal movement. In 2000 or 2001, Verily and I went to a conference in Santiago, and on the way we went to Lima, and we went to a museum, and there was one of these Peruvian, Ahuari, feather pieces. And this one is actually in the Cleveland Museum. And that's yellow feathers and blue feathers. And I told Verily, I said, I'm going to weave one of those. I just love the simplicity of the whole thing. These were found at one site in 1943 in clay containers. They found 96 of them. And they're very, very long. And they don't think they were worn. They feel as though they were made some sort of backdrop. So they were sort of somehow attached to a building or a wall. So you had a huge kind of checkerboard. And so I used linen and silk to do it. And I used wedge weave again. But wedge weave on the tiniest of scales. This piece is probably 5 feet wide by whatever the other one was. And again, for people who don't know or don't think they practice the creative process, arriving at this solution took a while. Here's the beginning of it, and on the left-hand side, I was thinking I wanted to do kind of a feather thing, make it look like feathers, but then I opted for the right-hand side, where it's much more intimate, because I think you get the color pixelation sort of works better. So anyway, so that's what that piece was. So that's wedge weave. This is the process that the piece on the wall went through. The piece on the wall is sandwiched between those boards with the C-clamps. And then it's dumped in water. Sometimes I'll put it on the stove and boil it. And then this is it coming out. And so you see how potent that dye is. Probably this was one of the more successful pieces. This is before it's dyed. And then this is it after it's dyed, along with the strips of cloth which are next to me on the wall here. And so that piece came out looking like that. Here's Dad. And here's my tribute to him. Because he did do the Mennonite kind of thing and the quilting and all that, one thing, that all the colors I use there are from sports jerseys, so I thought that that was some sort of connection to the sports world, about as close as I ever got to it. Although I did learn to be a marathon runner, but that doesn't take much. And this is how obsessive I can get. Sometimes I've employed my daughters to work on these pieces, sometimes with boyfriends, and then all of a sudden the boyfriend disappears. And I'm the happier for it. Poor Patrick. This is a warrior shirt from Ghana, and those are amulets around his neck. They're leather amulets that have prayers in them. And when I was chair of the Department of Art Design and Art History, I made this Chairman's War Shield, and the most annoying memos that I received, I folded and put into these little packets around the top part, and so it has a certain kind of aura to it. People wondering why I didn't respond. I said, oh, I did respond. Now this is now in the Longhouse. This is Jack Larson's, and when I sent it to him, it's on a little wooden table. This is a little digital clock. I can make one for every one of you if you want. You just have to get up during the night and keep changing it so you know what time it is. There, it was Jack's 75th birthday, and so I sent it to him that way. I am now, Eudora, little Jimmy Bassler is now 77. Like that. Can you believe it? Anyway, so they just keep moving around, and that's the way this goes. Mildred Constantine, who was a dear friend of Jack's and wrote most of his books, demanded that I make her one, And when you're 90 years old, how do you refuse a woman who's, you know, so sweet and wonderful? So her name is Mildred, but she goes by Connie, which she passed on last year. And I sent it to her with a 90 on it. And to sort of go full round, so we've got tie-dyes on the wall done in 1960, and these pieces, this is called 283 Kisses, based on the Oscar Wilde tomb in Paris, with all the smooching that went on the cold marble, if you've ever seen it. You know, all the lipstick. So I thought, well, that's sort of what this looks like. And here's one called Spotty. And here's a game I did for Lloyd Coatson, who loves Peruvian textiles. I thought the Wari tie-dyes were so confusing. I thought, what better way to make it more confusing than to make little square boxes on top of an already patterned thing, and you can move them around and make it that much more chaotic. And then finishing with one of my favorite slides. This happens to be the woman who did the spinning, and she's spinning silk right there. Notice the spindle whorl and the gourd that she spins her spindle in. This is 1970. Just walking down the street, I encountered her in this little shop, and it's her mother who wove the sashes. And then this is just the ability of textiles. I'm using crepe paper as a textile here. The ability of someone with few means to make some sort of a statement about a celebration of some sort. I've always loved the color on this, the simplicity of this, and just the idea of all of us being able to be part of the joy of the creative process in a very simple way. And this is in a little village going down to Oaxaca, and this is a homeless person who lives on the railroad tracks going out of Los Angeles, who in the same way made this statement to give a sense of home. What he's done here, or she has done here, they weren't home when I found it, they've interlaced yarns and strips of cloth and rags into a chain link fence, which gives them a certain amount of privacy from the operation that's going on the other side of the fence, which is a place where they take apart motors of automobiles. I love that. Here's a close-up of it. A lot of time and thought went into that. You can sort of see that direction of them going into it. And then we talked about pattern that I was learning. This is a brick pattern, and this is in a little place just north of Puerto Vallarta. And the man has a beer joint on the sand, and he painted his white bricks red because he wanted to look like red brick. And when he got to the coconut palm, he decided he would use that same pattern, and so that's a coconut palm that ends the whole thing, and I love the idea. So, that's it.